Every debt must eventually be paid, no matter how long it takes. Explore the gripping and intense tales of those who finally took back what was rightfully theirs against all odds. Subscribe now to watch the ultimate payback happen in real time.
My husband was at a luxury spa resort while our son was lying in the ICU, and he texted me, "Tied up in meetings, will call you tonight." But he had no idea what I had already put into motion. The waiting room outside the pediatric intensive care unit smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee. I had been sitting in that same blue plastic chair for 11 hours. My back ached. My eyes burned. And the only sound I could focus on was the soft beeping coming from behind a door where my son Noah was fighting to breathe. Noah was 9 years old. He had been hit by a car while riding his bike 2 blocks from our house. A neighbor had called 911. I had been the one to run down the street barefoot screaming his name before the ambulance even arrived. My husband, Daniel, had been the one not there. When I finally got a signal on my phone and called him, it rang 4 times before he picked up. His voice was relaxed, almost lazy. "Hey, what's up?" Like I was calling to remind him to pick up milk. I told him our son was being rushed into emergency surgery. I told him the doctors were not sure about internal bleeding. I told him to come now. He said he was 2 hours away at a work retreat in the Berkshires. He said he would wrap things up and get on the road. He said not to worry. That was 11 hours ago. The text came at 9:43 that evening. "Tied up in meetings, will call you tonight." I stared at the screen for so long that the words blurred. Meetings. Our son was on a ventilator and my husband was in meetings. I set the phone face down on the seat beside me and pressed both hands flat against my thighs to keep them from shaking. Something inside me went very quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from peace, the kind that comes right before a decision. I want to tell you that I spent those first hours consumed entirely by fear for Noah, and I was afraid, more afraid than I have ever been in my life. But underneath that fear, something else was already stirring. Because the truth was that Daniel's absence that night was not the first time I had been alone when I should not have been. It was only the most unforgivable. Noah's surgery lasted 4 more hours. The surgeon came out at 2 in the morning and told me that my son was stable, that the bleeding had been controlled, that he would need time but he was going to be okay. I cried so hard I slid down the wall of the hallway onto the floor, and a night shift nurse sat down beside me and held my hand without saying a single word. Daniel arrived at 6 in the morning. He walked into the waiting room with his overnight bag still on his shoulder, stubble on his jaw, and a coffee cup from a gas station. He hugged me and said he was sorry he could not get there faster. He said the roads had been terrible. He said he had been out of cell range for part of the drive. I looked at him over his shoulder. I noticed the way his shirt was slightly wrinkled in a way that was not from sleeping in a car. I noticed a faint trace of a fragrance that was not mine. And I thought very clearly, he is lying to me. He has been lying to me. He has been lying to me for a long time. And tonight, while our son was in surgery, he was lying somewhere else entirely. I did not say any of that. I pulled back, looked him in the eye, and said, "I'm glad you're here." Because I had already decided something in that waiting room. I was not going to confront him before I knew everything. I was going to know everything first. In the days that followed, I barely left Noah's bedside. He woke up on the second day, groggy and confused, and the first thing he said was, "Mom, my bike is probably broken." I laughed for the first time in 48 hours. Daniel came and went. He sat with Noah for stretches of time, looked appropriately concerned, brought flowers from the hospital gift shop. He played the role well. He had always played the role well. But I was watching differently now. I noticed the way he silenced his phone when he set it face down. I noticed he started taking his laptop into the bathroom when he charged it overnight. I noticed that on the 3rd evening when Noah fell asleep early and I suggested Daniel and I go get dinner together, he found a reason to step outside and make a call first. He came back 10 minutes later and said he was exhausted. Maybe they should just order in. I ordered in. And I started paying closer attention. It was a parking receipt that broke it open. I found it in the pocket of a jacket I was moving to the coat closet. A receipt from a hotel in Lenox, Massachusetts, dated the same weekend as the retreat. The Stonefield Inn. The charge was for 2 nights. The retreat that Daniel's company supposedly booked was a conference center in Pittsfield, not a hotel in Lenox. not the kind of place that costs $380 a night. I photographed the receipt. I put the jacket back exactly where I found it. I went into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, and I stood at the sink looking out the window at the backyard where Noah's broken bike was still leaning against the fence, and I felt the full weight of what I already knew but had not yet proven. His name was Daniel Mercer. He was 38 years old. He was a regional sales director for a logistics company. He coached Noah's baseball team on Saturdays. He brought me coffee in bed on Sunday mornings. And he had been at a luxury inn in the Berkshires with another woman, while our son was airlifted to a trauma center 40 miles away. I needed more than a parking receipt. I reached out to a private investigator through a recommendation from a friend of a friend, a woman named Patricia, who ran a small firm and whose reviews mentioned the word discreet in almost every entry. I met her at a coffee shop near my office on a Tuesday afternoon. I brought the photograph of the receipt. I brought printouts of 3 credit card statements I had pulled from our joint account, statements showing cash withdrawals I could not account for, dinner charges at restaurants I had never been taken to, 2 purchases at a jewelry boutique in the city. Patricia looked through everything with the unhurried focus of someone who had seen worse and found it, and she said she would be in touch within a week. She was in touch in 4 days. Her findings were thorough and in the way of things you already suspect but have not yet seen written down, devastating. Daniel had been seeing the woman named Renee for at least 14 months. Renee was 31, worked in marketing, and had an apartment in the south end of Boston that my husband had been visiting on a near-weekly basis under the cover of client dinners and regional check-ins. Patricia had photographs. She had credit card records. She had a reservation confirmation pulled from an email address Daniel used for personal accounts for a 2-night stay at the Stonefield Inn. Checked in the Friday evening before Noah's accident. Checked out the Sunday morning after. He had been there all weekend. He had stayed through the night. He had driven back not when Noah was in surgery but some hours afterward, arriving at the hospital at 6 in the morning having spent the prior night in a bed that was not ours. Patricia also found something else. 3 months before the accident, Daniel had taken Noah's car, the old sedan we kept for errands, in for a routine inspection. The mechanic had flagged a brake calibration issue and noted it in the service record as something to monitor and address at the next service. Daniel had signed the paperwork. He had never scheduled the follow-up. When I asked Noah's pediatrician later, carefully, as a general question, whether the timing of the bike accident had any connection to whether the car parked on that street had played a role, she said she could not speak to that specifically, but Patricia, who was thorough, found that the car that had struck Noah belonged to a neighbor who had borrowed Daniel's vehicle twice in the month prior, while his own car was in the shop. The brake issue was never resolved. I sat with that information for 3 days before I could think clearly about it. What Daniel had done was not criminal in the way that could be proven. The brake issue on a borrowed vehicle, the timing, the accident, there were too many steps between cause and consequence to make a legal case. But I knew that my husband had signed paperwork, decided the follow-up was inconvenient, and moved on. And weeks later, our son had been struck by a vehicle whose brakes had been compromised by that same negligence. I did not let that knowledge make me reckless. I let it make me precise. The plan I put together over the following 2 weeks was not about rage. Rage had already burned through me, quietly, in the hours after I first looked at Patricia's folder. What remained was something colder and more purposeful. I was going to dismantle what Daniel had built on the foundation of my trust, piece by piece, and I was going to do it in the right order. I started with his employer. Daniel had been expensing his visits to Renee. Not all of them, he was careful enough for that, but enough. Patricia had cross-referenced the company card statements against the personal card records and identified 11 dinners and 4 hotel stays that had been submitted as client entertainment. 2 of the hotel receipts matched dates when, according to his calendar, he had no scheduled client visits in those cities. I compiled the documentation into a clean, factual summary, attached the supporting records, and sent it anonymously to his company's HR compliance department and to the chief operating officer directly. I did not editorialize. I let the numbers speak. I then called a family law attorney. Her name was Sandra, and she had the kind of calm authority that made me feel, for the first time in weeks, that I was not navigating this alone. I laid out everything: the affair, the financial records, the documented dishonesty, the circumstances around Noah's accident. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "You have done more of my work for me than most clients do in 6 months." She advised me to make copies of everything and store them somewhere Daniel could not access. She told me what to file, when, and why. She told me what to ask for. I left her office with a clarity I had not felt since before any of this began. The last thing I needed was the right moment. I chose a Sunday afternoon, 3 weeks after Noah came home from the hospital. Noah was at my mother's house for the day. Daniel was home, relaxed, watching a game. He was in the kind of easy domestic mood that I had once found comforting, and now recognized as the mood of a man who believed he was safe. I sat down across from him at the kitchen table and I said, "I need to show you something." I placed the folder in front of him. He opened it slowly. His expression went through several changes that I watched with a kind of detached attention, confusion, then recognition, then a careful blankness that I knew was him calculating. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Where did you get this?" I said, "It doesn't matter." He tried the angles I expected. He said it was complicated. He said things had not been right between us for a long time. He said Renee was not what I was imagining. He said he had been going to end it. He was sorry. He had been under enormous pressure. He had not been himself. He loved his family. I let him finish. Then I pulled out a second sheet of paper, the service record from the mechanic with Daniel's signature at the bottom, and I set it on top of the folder. The silence after that was different. I told him I was not going to take legal action over the brake issue, not because I thought he deserved mercy, but because our son did not need to grow up knowing that his father's negligence had put him in the ICU. That was a burden Noah would never carry if I could help it. But I wanted Daniel to know that I knew. I wanted him to sit with that knowledge. I wanted him to understand exactly what his choices had cost. He did not say anything for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. Quieter, stripped of the performance. He said, "I don't know what to say to you." I said, "You don't have to say anything. The attorney will be in touch on Monday. I'd like you to be out of this house by Friday." He left the following Wednesday. The weeks that followed were not easy. They were not the kind of clean, cathartic aftermath that I had imagined in the darkest hours of the hospital waiting room. There were logistics and lawyers and the particular exhaustion of being a single parent to a child still healing. There were nights when Noah asked where his father was, and I said the truest thing I could say to a 9-year-old, that his dad and I were working to something hard, but that both of us loved him, and that was never going to change. Daniel's company concluded their internal review and terminated him before the divorce proceedings were finalized. He had not expected that. Renee, according to a mutual acquaintance who kept me informed despite my lack of enthusiasm for the updates, ended things the week after the termination. She had not signed up for a man with no income and a complicated divorce. I did not feel satisfaction at any of that the way I thought I might. What I felt was tired. And then, gradually, something else. I had a conversation with Noah's trauma surgeon about 3 months after the accident, Dr. Tama, Amara Chen, who had operated on my son in the middle of the night and who had a direct, warm manner that I had trusted from the first time I met her. She mentioned in passing that her hospital was starting a family support program for parents of pediatric trauma patients and that they were looking for community volunteers to help run weekend orientation sessions. People who had been through it and come out the other side. I said yes before I fully thought about what I was agreeing to. The program was called the Noah Project. I did not name it. The hospital had named it 3 years before my son was born, after another child, another family. But sitting in my first volunteer training session and seeing that name on the folder, I felt something shift in my chest in a way I did not entirely understand. I started showing up on Saturday mornings. I sat with parents in the same blue plastic chairs I had once occupied, in the same waiting rooms that smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee, and I did what the night shift nurse had done for me. I stayed. I did not try to fix anything, I just stayed. Noah came with me sometimes. Once he was well enough, he would sit in the family lounge and draw pictures. He had developed a sudden enthusiasm for drawing during his recovery, and occasionally a younger child in the waiting room would wander over and watch, and Noah would show them how to draw a dinosaur or a rocket ship with complete seriousness and patience. I watched him do that one Saturday afternoon, 9 years old, still a little pale from months of recovery, explaining to a 4-year-old the precise correct way to draw a Tyrannosaurus Rex, and I thought, he is going to be fine. He is actually going to be fine. He is actually going to be fine. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday in early spring. I signed the papers in Sandra's office with a cup of coffee cooling beside me, and a rectangle of pale sunlight falling across the desk. Sandra shook my hand afterward and said I had handled one of the hardest situations she had seen in her practice with more clarity than most people manage. I thanked her. I meant it. I drove home through streets that were finally turning green again after a long winter, and I sat in the driveway for a moment before going inside. I thought about the night in the waiting room. The blue plastic chair. The 11 hours I had spent alone, not knowing if my son was going to live. I thought about the text message, tied up in meetings, "We'll call you tonight," and how I had set the phone face down and gone quiet inside and made a decision. I had not made that decision out of anger, though there had been plenty. I had made it because I understood in that moment that I had been the only person in my marriage who was actually present, not perfect, not without my own mistakes and blind spots and failures, but present, and I was not willing to let someone who had chosen absence, over and over again, in 100 small and one enormous way, continue to shape the direction of my life. I got out of the car. I went inside. Noah's backpack was by the front door, covered in the stickers he had been collecting since his first week back at school. A drawing he had made was taped to the refrigerator. A house, 2 figures, labeled in his handwriting, me and Mom. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, just looking at it. Then I put the kettle on, opened the window to let in the spring air, and started thinking about what I wanted to do next. There is a family I have been meeting with through the hospital program, a mother named Grace, and yes, I noticed the name, and yes, I let myself feel that, whose daughter was in a car accident 2 months ago and is only just beginning to walk again. Grace is 37 and exhausted and trying to hold a job and a family together while also sleeping in a hospital recliner 4 nights a week. I brought her coffee last Saturday. I sat with her for 2 hours. I did not tell her my story, not all of it, not yet, but I told her that I'd been in the same chair, that it had felt impossible, and then, slowly, it had begun to feel survivable. That survivable had eventually become something more than that. She asked me how long it took. I told her honestly, longer than I wanted, shorter than I feared. She nodded. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. And after a while she said, "I just need to know it gets better." I looked at her across that waiting room. The same waiting room where I had once sat alone and decided to stop waiting for someone else to show up. And I said, "It does. I promise you it does." I meant every word.